welcome everyone. Welcome to this session that we've called Witches, Trees and Trolls. I think initially I'm going to ramble for a minute or two just because we're aware of people coming over from the keynote. So I won't sort of dive into full speed for a couple of minutes. We called this session Witches, Trees and Trolls. And the aim of it is to look at how the imagery contained within traditional stories offers me as a storyteller new ways of exploring the natural world and new avenues for my creativity. And within that, I hope that this session will encourage people to look at traditional tales maybe in a different light and consider how they might invite us as 21st century people to explore the world around us more creatively, and how that in turn can inspire and inform our own creativity. I'm gonna, because I don't want to have to make you sit and stare at me for the whole time. We've got some images to go with all this. So if I can share my screen and get it behaving properly, which is always a big thing for me, because I seem to spend half my time with things like this, going around in circles, trying to, there we go, we want that. Ping, there we go. We're into Witches, Trees and Trolls. My name's Gordon. I'm Gordon MacLellan, and I work as an artist and a storyteller called Creeping Toad. So most people just know me as Toad. And as Creeping Toad, I tell old stories, I make up new stories, but essentially I use creativity as a way to encourage people to explore the world around them, and through that creativity find their own ways of understanding it. So rather than me coming in as an expert and telling people this is what should be done, this is what you should feel, this is how you should X, Y, or Z, we invite people to explore, experience, and share the world for themselves. More about what I do will come up as we go. We've also put in the chat a list of various Creeping Toad social media points and things like that, if you wanted to find out more about my work and what I do. But when we look at traditional stories just now, we seem to have got tangled up in a story of our own that's about analysing traditional stories. And they seem to become metaphors for everything and anything, anything from a fear of this, that, or the next thing, to a young woman's preparation for marriage, which is one I was reading about recently, to a journey into our subconscious. We keep using traditional stories or reusing traditional stories, and while those are all commendable issues to explore, sometimes it's simply worth reading or listening to a story because it's a story. If you go for a walk, do you go for a walk through the deep woods? Do you dance in the green woods? Do you set out through the woodland and hope to encounter a sinister wolf, man, a metaphor, monster? I've had people tell me all those things about old stories, and I just think, actually, maybe you could listen to a story and go for a walk in the woods, and don't overanalyze it. I mean, we are a storytelling species. I think our greatest communications, our greatest ways of changing minds is through stories. And if you don't believe me, just go and listen to a group of people chatting. Or look at yourself, actually, and just see how long it is before someone tells a story. Not some big ancient high myth, but I mean, it might be talking about going shopping the day before. It might be what happened at the gym. It might just be the latest episode of a favorite soap opera. But we recount experiences as stories, and we We tell stories, we share experiences through stories, and we don't watch soap operas for their deep metaphorical meanings. I mean, some of us might do it, but I'm sure most people just watch them. Because, partly because we're nosy and we like looking at other people's lives. But when we've been watching the latest episodes of, let's stick with those soap operas, the latest episode of a soap opera, we will still discuss what's happened. We'll challenge the decisions that have been made. We'll argue about the rights and wrongs of people's final choices. And that's how we as communities and as individuals often resolve things. We do it through stories. And so it is with traditional stories. I mean, it'd be really nice to think that we make our decisions as communities or as countries, as governments, that we make decisions based on the analysis of information and the careful sort of reasoned debate and discussion. And sometimes we do, but usually, and you see this with every charity's fundraising appeal, we respond to the story. And it's the struggle to save a child or a tiger cub or a forest. It's the story that brings commitment and brings change. It's emotion that we respond to. And we like good story. So for me, the bucket full of toads that's on the screen just now is that's one of my annual stories, is the need to go and rescue sometimes up to 1,000 toads on their annual migration from hibernation to ponds. They get stuck in a ditch near where I live. It's a culvert with a very steep man-made wall. They come trundling down out the woods, and some of them manage to get up the wall and over to the ponds. A lot don't. And if there weren't people like me just going down with a bucket, they'd die. So that's one. We can have the discussion, we can have the debate, but in the end, it's the story, it's the thought of loss that makes us act. So let's go back to traditional stories. It's easy to find traditional stories. We tend to find them sort of being reinterpreted everywhere. I mean, when we can find stories that haven't been doctored too much to suit somebody's particular direction, we are working with ancient stories. We're working with tales that have been in circulation for centuries. We tend to meet them through an analysis. This is a story about, and these days there are so many books and workshops and online courses about understanding legends that it gets a bit tiring. I mean, I'm not a traditional storyteller. I am a storyteller. And I just get tired of it. I just think there's a strong tendency to analyze and overanalyze and then dissect and then repiece and then interpret and then reinterpret and then stand on our heads and then stuff the story in a cupboard because we don't like it, until the simple story at the heart of it all sort of gets lost. And that's really what I'd like to invite you to do in this session, is just to say, go and read or listen to traditional tales. Just listen to them or read them simply as stories. We can find our modern reasonings within them. They almost certainly weren't the reasonings used or the teachings that were meant to be imbued in the first place. We can find ways of interpreting that suit us. Doesn't mean it was, as I said, doesn't mean it was the original form. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's wrong or that any of it's wrong. But sometimes if we went back 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 years, sitting around a fire in a hut, in a cave, in a shed, in a tent, sometimes, like us, talking about soap operas, people just like to hear a good story. So if you want to go looking for stories, go rummaging. Go looking for stories. I mean, there's all the classic collections, whether it's Grimm or whoever, but you might just go looking for stories about your own town, you know, your region, you know, your country, your family, if you're on a system where you can identify a lineage that works like that. I mean, in Scotland, where I come from, if you hadn't worked that out by the accent, you know, a lot of the individual clans have very strong stories that run through the clan that are almost tied into identities. And they're tied into the history and the mythology of that particular tribal gathering of people. But just go looking for stories. If you can't find stories that definitely belong to the place where you live, you might find stories from similar landscapes, similar environments, stories that hold echoes for the places where you walk. So that, you know, again, across most of Europe, if you find stories about old forests, the trees that are being talked about will be the trees that are growing in our neighborhoods. So we find beech trees all over the continent. We find oak trees. Birch trees come in the northern latitudes, but also on the higher mountains and hills. So stories from Ireland or from Scotland about birch trees, say, if we tell them in other parts of the world, people recognize the tree and respond to it. They may then disagree with what the story says, but that's fine. A story doesn't need you to like it. But we might find stories that resonate, and it might be landscapes, it might be trees, it might be the animals that live here now, it might be the animals that lived here once. So find a story, read yourself a story, tell yourself a story, or listen to someone else's story, but simply enjoy a story as a story and think about it afterwards. And if you can, take it outside. Just go and sit on a park bench with your story. Let the story inhabit the place where you are, and appreciate the story. It might not be enjoyable, but we've got to hope it would be memorable. A lot of traditional stories do not conform to 21st century standards of anything. They're often incredibly violent. They're often grim. They're often just downright unpleasant. And one of my little tests on a story that hasn't been, sort of, if you like, edited too much is that quite a lot of accounts that are traditional, traditional stories that have been written down, often recorded in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they don't have nice organized endings, not necessarily a happy ever after, but even just the closing sentence that says, and from that day to this, there has never been ... Often they just stop. And as I said, often they're not very nice. I've mentioned Scotland. Scotland's brilliant for stories that range from everything between the incredibly beautiful and sad and mournful Selkie stories, which as soon as you hear, are sort of, it's one of those we're all doomed moments in a Selkie story. They will end in sorrow. But we go from that, or from that beauty, to the sort of downright bloodthirsty, vengeful legends of those Highland clans. So this carving is from the Well of the Seven Heads. near Invergarry in the Highlands. I'm not going to tell you the story. If you want to find out, just go and look it up. And if you want a really nice grisly tale to end whatever part of the day you're in, the Seven Heads is a good one to do it. Oh, there we go. But stories do connect us to places. I mean, they might be the legends that say this is what happened in this place. They might be full-scale myths that tell us how mountain ranges formed, where the dragon that lies in the sea lies, why there is a millstone still grinding at the bottom of this whirlpool here. We might have, if you like, those bigger stories, but equally that relationship between people, places, and stories is a subtle one. And stories might seem trivial. There's lovely stories about angry sparrows, you know, tiny little birds and all the trouble they can cause. The story that connects you to a place might be barely a story at all, a sentence, a 2-sentence snippet of folklore might do it. Again, going back to Scotland, Rowan tree, red thread and lammer bead, pits the witches to their speed is just a little, it's a charm that would be spoken. And as you speak it, you tie 2 twigs from a rowan tree together, you bind them into a cross with red thread, and onto the thread you then fix a lammer, an amber bead, and that will keep you safe from danger. But knowing that, or having that in your head, makes you walk through, gives you something else to think about when you walk through a wood. And as you walk through that wood, you might meet elder trees. In our stories, elder trees, well, you have to be careful because they might be witches in disguise. Apparently, a witch who's threatened might just turn into an elder tree. But equally, if you're out at night and you're scared and you think you're being pursued by ghosts, robbers, whatevers, an elder tree will give you shelter from danger. So find an elder tree and tuck yourself under it. And elder trees are these incredibly beneficent givers of food to anyone and everyone all through the summer, from elder flowers, which give us elderflower fritters and elderflower champagne and elderflower cordial, to the berries that will be coming in the UK where I live in September and October. We get elderberry jelly and elderberry wine. Just knowing not big stories, but little snippets of stories around a single tree will help you look at that tree in a different way. And all of this is about, for me, it's encouraging you just to explore some old stories and hear the voices of our ancestors in the stories they told. And that line in the PowerPoint should have got split, I think. And feel the place around you. Use stories to feel a place, to feel a landscape, and find a bit of joy in stories about ordinary things. And this isn't necessarily then about sending, oh, you've got to go make up your own stories. For me, feeding creativity almost never makes sense. You know, creativity is such a subtle process that for me, something like this, just going outside and enjoying a landscape, reading a story, telling a story, listening to a story, is about connecting to place. It's also about feeling emotions and processes and letting everything else go and just relaxing into the experience and feeling the experience. And at the end, going back to my everyday world and to whatever the creative challenge that I'm facing at the time is, if you like, with a bit of green in my eyes and maybe with the echo of someone else's tread echoing through my head. Stories are a great way of just letting ourselves go, letting ourselves experience something, and letting the experience then feed back into ourselves. And I'm going to stop there. I'm a storyteller. It's quite hard for me to shut up. So I will then abruptly shut up and say, have you got any questions? But let's leave this bit now. I'll stop the share so we can all see each other a bit more. Thank you. And now we're in complete silence. If you have any questions, why not pop them in the chat, and we'll pick them up, and if I can answer them, I will.
And if you feel more comfortable, I believe you are able to unmute yourselves doing that. We have about 3 minutes before that next session starts.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this was such a peaceful session. I went to Ireland and I did the same thing, and I just came back from Barcelona a few months ago, and the history is just incredible. But that immersion of I like how you pointed out, the ancestors, what were really their points of views, and why were these stories told the way they were, and how politics and economics and rights of the time, religion of course influenced that. And this was just such a great session. I definitely in Dublin I went to the Leprechaun Museum, and they told all the stories, and like this just brought me back there. But yeah, it's such an important thing. I think a lot of that can be overlooked, right? You're so focused on the traditional way of telling, even the American way of Hollywood way of telling a story, and it's nice to break cultural bounds. But yeah, this was just great. I loved it.
Thank you. That's really kind. That's really good to hear. And oh, how nice that you got to Ireland and to Barcelona, and just yeah. So where are you tuning in from just now?
I am based here in Tampa, Florida.
Oh, right.
But I'm actually moving to Washington, D.C. in 4 weeks. So talk about history again.
Yes,
like,
yeah.
Yeah. And I think you were like, I read a really good book about, I love Champagne. So I went to the Champagne region in France. If you really were like, there's this book called The Widow Clicquot. She produces the bottle called The Widow, or, The Widow Clicquot. And her story about being a female entrepreneur in the champagne industry with a competition like Moet. It was fascinating. And so being there in those caves that are like thousands of years old, it's just phenomenal. But yeah, just so good. So good.
Thank you. Fascinating. Okay.
I really liked how you talked about just being out and about in nature and just feeling. And when you spoke about the elder trees, it's not a usual thing in Canada to do anything with elder trees.
Really? Okay.
No, and I can remember so clearly, both of my parents were from England, and we would go out in the bush to look for these trees and come back with just bushels of these flowers, and just the intoxicating smell of these flowers, and then going down in the basement to see them in these vats going, is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? Wow, that just brings all kinds of sensations. Yeah.
I love, and elderflower fritters and elderflower cordial is just fritters in particular. It's like eating, but suddenly we're back in Champagne. Elderflower fritters feel like battered champagne. You just eat them and they sort of explode and crumble in your mouth. And elder trees are just for trees that get overlooked. People are very good at talking about, in America, maybe redwoods and cottonwoods, and over here it's oak trees, and the elder just sort of quietly gets on being an elder tree. And there are so many stories and so many lives that just feed in and out of elder trees, that they're really, if you wanted one tree to look at that the way elder trees are woven into our lives.
The only one I can remember is Monty Python.
But that wasn't that a lark. Sorry, that for anyone who hasn't seen Monty Python, sorry, that's an entirely in joke, so we'll leave that.